you will, start with me in the book of Hosea. We'll be picking up there in that book, and I want us to notice, we noticed verse 1 last week, and we just got 11 verses in chapter 1. So I just want us to notice a few words out of verse 1, then we'll jump right into verse 2. And there's something that I believe should be very important to us inside of verse 1. But I want us to see the very first phrase or thought phrase inside of verse 1, and it reads this way: the word of the Lord came unto Hosea. Whose book is this? It's the Lord's book. It's God's book. Where did this word come from that He's giving to these people and that's being penned and written down for us to read? The Lord. Now, who does that exclude? Everybody else. Thank you. That's the best answer. Everybody else. That means you and me, we did not get together and say, this is how we think this book should go. And this is how we're going to put it together. And I hope you've noticed this, and this is one of my favorite things inside of the Minor Prophets. Thus saith the Lord, the word of the Lord came unto. What does this collection of books tell us about God and His Word? I believe it should tell us that God's serious about His Word, isn't it? And doesn't that tell us that's what God particularly thinks of His Word? It's His. But what does this tell us also about man and man's response to God's Word? What has happened in the Minor Prophets so far with God's people? Have they responded to God's Word? No, they haven't. I think what it tells us as we study the Minor Prophets, that man will do anything to stay in his current condition. Now, if we look at Israel, what is their current condition? I would suggest, and I think you would too, they are living in the condition of sin. They've left God to worship false gods. They have abused all of the people of their nation. They've abused their children. They've given up on God. And they'll do anything to stay in that condition. We just finished a book, and what was the end of that book? Oh, that's not going to come to pass. But I want us to start here. The word of the Lord, whose word is it? And that tells us it will come to pass because it's the Lord's word. And I think we should also make this comparison as we're thinking about this class today. Not much has changed, has it, since the time of Israel? Will men also today do anything they can to live the way they want? You know what we're saying when we say that? Man will do anything to stay in his sin. It's also sometimes true of you and me, isn't it? When we know something is sin, but we choose to do it anyways. When we know we have sinned, but we choose not to bring it back to the Lord and repent of those things, we do the same things, don't we, sometimes? So we must remember that what's happening in these books is God is calling His people to come home, but His people are not responding. We must recognize as we look at Matthew through the book of Revelation that God is still calling His people home, and that's you and me. That's the people of this world to come unto Him. So here's how it starts. It's God's word that begins. And look at verse 2. I find this really interesting. Look at the first phrase of verse 2. The beginning of the word of the Lord. Whose word is it again? Verse 1 and verse 2. It's the Lord's. Look at this. He kind of gives it a three-time whammy here. Verse 1, verse 2. Now look at it as verse 2 continues. And the Lord said, Go, take unto thee a wife of whoredom and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. Now there's a great situation happening in this book, and we're going to see it play out. And the first thing that Hosea is told to do here is to take up a wife. But what wife? A harlot is usually what we would call. We don't usually look at the phrase that's found in this passage, a wife of whoredom. But who is she? What was her profession? Well, you know what it was. Let's just use this word. Her profession was the profession of sin. So here, as this is being described, in the land of children of whoredom, in the land that has committed great whoredom. Now look at this, the last phrase of this. Departing from the Lord. What had these people done that was such a great tragedy in their day? They departed from the Lord. Now that has many different forms, doesn't it? That can be in the way we live. We can depart from the Lord, can't we? We can depart from the Lord in our marriages, can't we? We leave the principles and precepts that God has provided. God had provided for them everything they needed to know as well. That's right. Many, 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 and I'll keep including that to the day we live, gods of paganism included idolatrous worship that included the harlot, both male and female. You get into the New Testament and you start looking at all of these Greek gods and goddesses. Do you know what their worship was about? Same thing that's being described right here. You get into 1 and 2 Thessalonians, these people who have left all of these great temples of their day. Do you know what happened in those temples? Same thing that we're talking about today inside of this book. It doesn't, and that's why I'm going to present something to us here. There are two views of this book. Some view that God is being strict on what He says, or God is being literal in what He says. Let me rephrase that. Not strict, but literal, and saying he must marry a woman of this classification. That's view number one. View number two, people take it this way. We're going to marry someone who has committed spiritual adultery. Now, as you go through this book, I see merits for both views. So I'm not going to make some great distinction of this. I do personally fall on the physical side. And that's the side I fall on. I see the merit for spiritual adultery because of what happens in verse 2. This land has committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. Can our children not be conceived in spiritual adultery? I see the premise behind that. And as we go through the book, I want us to look at it in both factions. Because whether we're talking about the physical act, which is going to be something we see throughout the book, and the end result is going to turn, or whether it's talking about something that's spiritual, the end result is the same. We've got to come out of it. And either way we look at this book, it has to be that way. In both ways we look at it, it does seem very hard for Hosea to endure. But what do we know about the Lord? Well, He means what He says. That's a very good way. But what do we know about the Lord? He's just. But what else do we know about the Lord? Well, yeah. What about 1 Corinthians chapter 10? Is God going to put on us more than we can endure? Is He? He says He won't. Will He? See, it's easy for us to say God is in control. But it's hard for us, and we just proved this to ourselves, it's hard for us to say, He won't put on me more than I can handle. Because here's what we say, and here's what comes of that end result. When I fail, who failed? You see, if I can say that it was too much for me to bear, it wasn't my fault. But if I could bear it, whose fault is it? See, it's personal, isn't it? That's right. That's right. And we understand that as we look at this book. Now, the reason for doing this, as the background is indicating, was the purpose of illustrating to the nation of Israel the departure of God, which the whole land has committed. So look at verses 3 through 5. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter here described, who conceived and bare him a son. And the Lord said unto him, Call his name Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. And it shall come to pass that that day I will break the bow break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. What does the Lord know? This is an interesting question. What does the Lord know? Thank you. I was hoping no one would get real specific. What does the Lord know? He knows everything. Now make this personal for just a minute. What does the Lord know about you? I think that's much deeper, isn't it? The thoughts and intents of what? The heart. How much does God know about you? Everything. The thoughts and intents of the heart. You know what's interesting right now? Think about this. What does the Lord know about you right now? He knows your thoughts and intents, doesn't He? When we enter into worship here in just a little bit, what is the Lord going to know about you? He's going to know your thoughts and your intents, isn't He? He's going to know who you are, but more importantly, think about this, He's going to know what you are. It's a big comparison there, and the Lord knows of all of these things, and the Lord knows how all of these things are going to play out, and the Lord promised that He would cause these things to cease. Now, what's going to happen is in Assyria is going to invade Israel, and it's going to take place about 20 years later from the time this writing was originally penned. God promised to break the bow of Israel in this particular valley, and this means to destroy the military might of a nation. What happens when you destroy the military of a nation? Well, it's more than just weaken. What happens? They fall. That's right. That's been proven in history over and over and over again. Because what happens to a people? That's right. That's right. All that's going to come. Where did a lot of this, go back to the other books of the minor prophets we've been studying, where did a lot of these departures come from? There's two areas. Really three. I like to say there's three. Most say there's two. We'll call it three areas today. Number one, it came from the leadership of the nation, didn't it? How many of these books starts talking about the leaders, or somewhere in the book talks about the leaders who allowed these departures to happen? How many times in the minor prophets do you talk about the prophets or the priests inside of the temple of God and how they allowed these departures to happen? And how many times, this is why I call it three things, how many times do you see the Lord referencing the people and allowing these things to happen? About every book of the minor prophets references those three things. That's right. That's right. And in all of this, here's what we're seeing. We're seeing a God who cares about His people, but we're seeing a people who have forgotten about how to care about God. How many times do you read in these books of the minor prophets what God has done? How many times have we read about Egypt since we started our study of the books of minor prophets? About every book somewhere is a reference to what God had done to bring them out of their slavery. And yet here they are inside of this adultery. He's going to destroy the military might. He's going to destroy all of these things. Boy, isn't that true? You know, we've brought that up in every time we've studied one of these books, and it's been a little bit. Two other children, as you start in verse 6, are going to come to play. And she conceived again and bare a daughter, and God said unto him, and He mentions her name, and I'm going to plead just like you did. I'm not going to pronounce this name. But you look at it, you can spell it, you memorize that name. For I will have no more mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. But I will have mercy upon the house of Judah, and will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by the bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. What's God showing us here? What's God showing us here? But what's not going to prevail? There's something that's not going to prevail. What is it? We just read it in that verse. What is not going to prevail as you read verse 7? Israel will fall, and He'll have mercy on Judah. Okay, but follow it out. Follow the thought process. What happens after that? What is not going to keep them? Their army, the bow, the sword, the horse, the horseman, they're not in control. Nor are they the reason that a nation stands. This is the point I was preparing to make a moment ago, but how many times do nations in today only rely on their military might? Does that sound familiar to you? It should sound familiar to you, because every nation in this world does it. Yes, they are. That's right. Mm-hmm. Not, yep. It's interesting that God names them Yes, sir. Well, it all hinges on the way we view verse 6. And it hinges on the way we view what happens. Let me find the verse here. The way we view verse 6 and verse 3. There is a difference in verse 6 and verse 3. Verse 3, if you read verse 3, so he went and took Gomer, which conceived. You look at verse 6, and she conceived again. People have a hard time with that word again. Either it means she conceived for a second and third time with someone, or it means she conceived with someone specific. I've always been the opinion that it was Hosea. I don't try to read too much into that. But you know, it could very possibly not be. What was her profession again? We get the idea. So we kind of see and see that. Verse 9, you see the name. He called the name here, "You're not my people, and I will not be your God." Verse 10, "Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered, and it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, Ye are not my people, there shall be said unto them, Ye are the sons of the living God. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together, and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the days of Jezreel." Here in this particular scene, there's something happening. Their number once again would be great as the sand of the seashore. What's coming to be true about these people? What are they getting ready to face? Captivity. What usually comes along with captivity? Well, I think there's two things that come along with captivity. Number one, war. War. In the day and age we're looking at, people are usually taken captive after war. What comes along with war is the second thing that I think comes along with it: death, destruction, desolation, all these things. Their numbers would be smaller. The population would be in that scene. I think there's something prophetic happening here. I think we're looking not only at the people of Israel, which they never become in the scenes as great as they once were, but I think it has to do with the kingdom of Christ and how the kingdom of Christ would be innumerable. I think that goes all the way back to that promise that they would be a people who could not be measured as the sand of the sea. I think that has to do with the church as well. And verse 11 here is a prophecy of the reuniting of Israel and Judah, which would occur after captivity in Babylonia, which we talked about with Assyria captivity. Judah was captured and carried off. The remnants of Israel was carried into Assyria, now under Babylonian control. Everything would be conquered, and later they would be released out of their bondage to be able to begin anew and to start anew. But the complete fulfillment of this prophecy would be realized under the Messiah, a time in which there would be one head, which is Christ. In the particular scenes that's taking place, there's a play on words here in this particular scene. It's earlier use in the chapter. The people would be scattered from their land, but their bringing would be restore or restoration on the people of Canaan, and that's what's happening in chapter 1. So here's what happens in chapter 1. The people of God will be made few, but that's not how it's going to stay. That's not how it's going to stay. Now, what I like about chapter 1, if there's anything to like about chapter 1, is the end. A lot of times you read the books of the minor prophets and you start off very dark in these books. They're going to be carried into captivity. They're going to be laid waste. All of these things are going to take place. What happens at the end of this chapter? The people of God will be innumerable or unnumbered again as the sand of the seashore. There will be one head of this body of people. That's very important for us to see. And he keeps on going now as he begins verse 1. He's talking to the brethren, to the men and to the women. It's a play on the names of Hosea. God has now changed these names, and one now means you shall be my people. We'll see that as we go through the book. And the other means having obtained mercy, these two names here in verse 1. But verse 2 says, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away the whoredom out of her sight, and her adulteries from between her breasts. If you follow this book, now pause with me in verse 3. There's a lot of imagery in this book. A lot of people have a hard time studying this book. Do you see why people have a hard time studying this book? There's a lot of imagery in this book. Verse 2 brings a lot of imagery. Verse 3 brings a lot of imagery. Set her in the day that she was born, make her as a wilderness, set her as a dry land, slay her with thirst. Gomer, Israel, was warned that if she did not purify herself, that God was going to lay them waste and lay them open, as if they were just in their original form. Do you remember the people of Israel when they were chosen? Why did God choose the people of Israel? He loved them, number one, but there's another reason. They were few in number. What's happening again to the people of Israel? They're going back to few in number. I'm not saying there's a great comparison being made here to the numbers of people, but it is interesting that He loved them and He chose them because they were few in number, and He's bringing them back in a state where they're few in number. He's bringing them back to where they were. Now, verses 2 and verse 3, I do not believe have a distinct reference to Gomer herself. I believe they have a reference to Israel. All this book is talking about Israel and how they're supposed to come back, and He's going to bring this. Though they're directed at Gomer, the real application is Israel, just as an unfaithful wife would be expected to come back to her faithful husband. Thus we have God, the husband, and Israel, the wife. Verse 4, I will not have mercy upon her children, for they be the children of whoredoms. Here's why I often look, and this is why I often look back and say, is this the children of Hosea and Gomer? This is one of the reasons I will say that it's not the children, chapter 1. I look at it in both particular directions. God would show mercy to Israel's children because they were corrupted. Now, one of the reasons I look at chapter 1 and say this could be Hosea's children is because as you enter into chapter 2, you're talking about Israel. You're talking about Israel. And here, Israel's children had been corrupted. Let me ask you this question. How much time does it take to corrupt a child? I think very little too, doesn't it? What does one have to do to corrupt a child? Well, that's a question we don't really want to answer, isn't it? Well, we could neglect them. That's one way. It's very much one way. We can neglect our children, and thus they can live lives of corruption, live lives of sin. What's another way a child's life can be filled with corruption? The greatest thing we don't want to talk about, example. How did these children learn? How did these children of Israel learn to live like this? All right, well, let me ask this question to parents. This is a question that does not need to be answered. That's right. It goes all the way through the system. But think about it to the parents. What do your children see? What do my children see? How did this happen? I believe it's example. But I believe that example led to neglect. I think that plays into it as well. Of course, there are a number of factors that could lead into this. But one generation's sinfulness often produces horrible consequences for the next generation. That's true when you're talking about a nation, but it's just as equally true when you're talking about a spiritual body. Now, we don't like to discuss that, do we? That's right. That's right. From the very beginning to the end of their kings, All of their leadership was bad. Well, let me ask you a question. Now, we're not going to create a political conversation this morning, but I'm going to use our political system to drive a point home. Does it matter who's in the White House for you to live a Christian life? Neither does it matter who is king of Israel for Israel to stick with God. Does it matter? Does it make a difference who is king and who is president? Of course it does. But does the president demand or dictate your faith? Does the king demand or dictate your faith? It's one of the many unspoken problems of the people of Israel. And I believe this is one of the reasons why God did not want them to have a king. The people declared, they cried, "Give us a king to be like the rest of the world." The problem was they got what they asked for, wasn't it? They became just like the rest of the world. Not in the fact that they had a king, but in the fact of the way they lived. Always has, always will, isn't it? And that's interesting, because that's still... That's right. That's where this all boils down to. And I'm glad we've kind of come to this in verse 4, because it will help us as we go through this particular verse. If we make this a literal discussion, which we want to do for just a minute, and we're talking about Gomer, the wife of Hosea, who made her, after she was married to Hosea, continue in that profession? Oh, it was someone. But who was it? It was her. It's true for you and me. The way we live, who makes us live this way? Let me ask you my favorite question when in this type of discussion. Who made you come here today? It's a question that really doesn't have to be answered, isn't it? We understand that in this life, we make decisions every day. Gomer did, Hosea did. But just as much as it's talking about these people, let's make it into a spiritual reality for just a minute. A literal and a spiritual application here. Who makes you be the Christian that you are? Or who makes you be the argument against Christianity that you are? Because one of the two is going to be true. That's right. That's right. But just as much as that is true, if we are for God, who can separate us? Just as much as we are following after Christ is the same decision-making process as when we are not following after Christ, because who is the center of that decision? I am so glad you do not make decisions in my brain. Just as much as I am so glad I don't make decisions in yours. Because then what would that do? That wouldn't make it my fault, would it? We don't like to be the blame. We don't want to be given the blame, do we? When something goes wrong, do you want to say, "I messed that up"? If it was you. You ever seen that happen at work? Something goes wrong, boss comes in, who did it? You can always tell who it is because it's that guy that's, kind of looking around at everybody else. Why does he not want to admit that he messed up? It's in the same question, isn't it? Who messed up? He did. Why do we not want to admit when we're in sin? Why does Israel not admit that they're in sin? Because they're going to have to take the responsibility that they are the ones and they are the reason that they are in sin. How many of us have an I don't care attitude? We can ask all day long about Israel, and I don't know how many of Israel had an I don't care attitude. I know that it only takes one I don't care attitude to permeate the whole. Which tells us our value in the Lord's church, doesn't it? What's your value? You're either going to be the one that holds us together or the one that tears us apart. One of those will eventually be true. But here in this particular, as we look at it physically, as we look at it spiritually, what is the concept that's at play in chapter 2? come back to the Lord. Come back to the Lord. Come back to the Lord. Especially as you follow it out with these children here. Verse 2, He'll have no mercy on them because of the way they were raised. Verse 5, listen to it. This is why He'll have no mercy. For their mother hath played the harlot. She that conceived them hath done shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers, and will give me bread and my water and wool and my flax and my oil and my drink. What was the primary focus of these people's lives? The physical life. Now, they followed after it, interestingly enough, in a very interesting way. My bread, my water, my wool, my flax, my oil, and my drink. Now, this is how we would do it. See, we wouldn't say, we're following after my bread. But we would say, I'm following after my house. What's the number one priority in families today? To have the nicest house on the block, isn't it? That's not been any different, has it? That's right. That's right. We're following after all of these things that we think are important. The biggest home, listen, is there anything wrong with having the biggest home and nicest home on the block? No. But when it's the priority, is there something wrong there? When it takes the place of God? The vehicle that you drove this morning, oh, don't we turn those into my bread, my oil, my flax, my drink? Oh, that shiny bank account. Don't we turn those into my bread, my oil, my flax, my drink? Aren't there things in this life that we go after that can be put into this category here? Of the people of Israel who sold out for physical pleasure. For food, for necessities. That's what begins here. What did they sell out for? For bread and water. Necessities. God's always taken care of Israel. When was there a day when they did not have bread or water? Well, there was maybe an hour we could say they didn't have water, but what did God do? He provided them water. There was a time when they didn't have bread, but what did God do for them? He provided them bread. And now they're selling God out because they need water and bread? Don't you see the irony in this? Don't you see the irony in the wool and the flax and the oil? When Israel was wandering in the wilderness, what did not wear out? When Israel was wandering in the wilderness, what never wore out? Their clothes, the shoes on their feet. I don't know about you, but I find myself becoming harder and harder on clothes and shoes. I can wear out a good pair of shoes in 3 months. Their shoes didn't wear out. And yet now they're selling themselves out for wool and flax and other things to make the necessities of life. Boy, that's right. That's right.
The biggest thing, or one of the biggest things I believe we face today in trying to change the world is ignorance.
I agree wholeheartedly. You know, there are a lot of topics we don't want to discuss, aren't there? Can you name a topic that you don't like to hear discussed? Or maybe, let me rephrase this, that people do not like to hear discussed from that place right there? Are there any topics we don't want to discuss? Hey, that's a good one. Boy, we don't like to discuss sin. We certainly don't like to discuss specific sins, do we? Are there any specific sins that people do not want to hear from the pulpit? The ones that we think we have hidden. Yeah, those are ones we don't want to hear about. Why do we not want to hear those? Why do we not want to hear those? You ever heard someone say, you stepped on my toes? Or you hit me right in the forehead? Why? Because that comes close to home. You know what Israel's biggest problem is? All of these things kept coming close to home and they kept shutting them down. What was the problem? They were. And thus, when sinful things came about, they didn't talk about them. And you're right, it led to a generation of folks who did not know what God expected of them. Here's the big question. Will God, or will the generations that come after us, know what God expects of them? That's a big question, isn't it? I believe as we talk about the mainstream groups of people, we can say, I don't think so. But let me make this hit real home. Let me make this hit right on home. And I'm going to use my child as an example of this. My children. Will Charlie and Colson know what God expects of them? There you go. If they're taught. I believe that's one of the great lessons that comes out of the book of Hosea. There is this generation of people who just do not know what God expects of them. And how did that happen? Well, the hard things did not get discussed. Are the hard things ever easy? No. That's right. That's right. That's the implication of this for sure. That's right. That's right. That's very true. But what's the responsibility of not only the parents, but also, think about this, of the church in dealing with hard subjects? Should we ignore them? That is one of our problems now. And I'm going to say it that way. That's one of our problems. If it's hard, we ignore it. We don't like to take care of it. That's right, but we try to make them last for an eternity, don't we? This book, I hope, should teach us that we've got to stick with the Lord. That's what the Lord's calling. Come back to me. And this great illustration is going to be used between Homer, or Gomer. Now I've made Hosea and Gomer put together, and that makes Homer. Gomer and Hosea, these two individuals are going to prove something to us as we go through this book. Hosea knows if she'll leave her ways, she can be his wife. But if she doesn't leave her ways, she can never return to him. The illustration is this: if Israel does not leave her ways, she cannot come back to the Lord. Now let's make the modern application of this. If the church does not leave its ways, it cannot come back to the Lord. That's what this book is teaching us as we study it. I know it's difficult. I know there's some big imagery in this book, but we'll study this book and make the applications we need to see what the church can be. Thank you so much for your discussion and your attention this morning.